Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's CPWR webinar on non-standard work arrangements in the U.S. construction industry. My name is Jessica Bunting. I'm the CPWR host and tech support for the event. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a few quick things. First, if you're having any technical difficulties, you can email me by responding to the WebEx reminder email that went out about an hour before the event. Or if you're already logged in, you can send me a message via the chat box. If you have any trouble hearing through your computer speakers, I recommend calling in using your phone instead. You can either switch the connection through WebEx or you can just turn off your speakers and call in using the information in the email that you received. We will take time at the end of today's presentation to answer questions. You can enter your questions at any time in the Q&A or chat box, and we'll do our best to answer all of them in order that they were received at the end. The webinar will also be recorded in full. I will automatically email that link to everyone after the event. You don't have to follow up with me to receive it. Our presenter today is Rebecca Jackson, the new Assistant Director of CPWR's Data Center. Thank you for joining me today, Becky, and I'll let you take it from here.
All right, thanks. Jess, can you hear me?
I can.
Can you hear me now? Excellent. All right. Well, so like Jess said, I'm Rebecca Jackson. I'm the new Assistant Director of the Data Center at CPWR. I've been here since January, and I have a background in occupational epidemiology. And I'm really excited about the opportunity to share this research, and am especially grateful for Sue Dong, who's the director of the data center here, who's helped me make sense of this complicated topic. Oh, and now I need to figure out how my slides, there we go. So today I'm going to start by defining non-standard work arrangements. I want to make sure that we're all on the same page and we know what I'm talking about when I use this term. After that, I'm going to provide you with the results of some data analysis that I've done. I'm a data person. I love data. And I'm going to try my best to make sure that we walk through each bit so that everyone knows what we're talking about. And like Jess said, at the end, we'll have time for questions. So a lot of words have been used and phrases in the last several years to talk about work arrangement. Things like contingent workers, day laborers, the gig economy, contract workers, temporary workers. And the unifying idea between all of these terms is that there is no expectation of permanent employment. What that means is that if you do a good job, that doesn't mean that you'll continue to have your job, and instead you expect that your work is probably temporary. Also implicit in these terms are description of who pays you, who supervises you, and who is responsible for your occupational safety and health. And the reason that we're interested in this from a health and safety perspective is that our jobs, and standard jobs specifically, are how we access legal and social benefits. Legal benefits like workers' comp, unemployment, minimum wage, and other employment law, and health and safety enforcement. There are also social benefits related to our job, things like health insurance, vacation and sick leave, and the wages and pay that determine what we can and can't buy in society. In addition to these health effects, there's accumulating evidence that job uncertainty itself can have an adverse effect on health, and that not knowing that your job is permanent can directly harm your health. Up until now, I haven't mentioned the construction industry, which is the basis of my talk. And I admit that when I came across these definitions about standard and non-standard work for the first time, one of my first thoughts was, doesn't all construction work have uncertainty about it continuing, and thus isn't all construction work non-standard? Well, in 2017, John Howard described in an American Journal of Industrial Medicine paper that there are really two forms of standard employment. And in construction work, there's a craft model of standard work. In this model, workers with specialty construction skills are dispatched to different employment projects for different lengths of time. It's project-based. When the project ends, so does the worker's employment. The work site changes. You go from place to place for a temporary basis, and there's complex supervision involved. This is what standard construction work looks like. In many ways, the terms from the last slide that are used to describe new models of work are similar to what we think of as standard work in the construction industry. But understanding and studying these new and developing forms of work arrangement is a priority, including a priority in the construction industry. The data I'm going to present today are going to show that at least in terms of demographic and job characteristics, there are differences between people who report different kinds of work arrangements in construction. Rather than continuing to opine about this, I'd like to share some data. The data that I have comes from the current population survey, which is administered by the Census Bureau using a probability selected sample of about 60,000 households. Each household that's selected answers 4 months of questions, and comprehensive information is collected about labor force, employment, unemployment, hours of work, earnings, demographic information, you name it. It's super detailed, and it's designed to be that way. It isn't designed to provide 1 or 2 numbers, but a large amount of data to describe what we all know is a very complex labor market. In addition to the regular labor force questions, the CPS often includes supplemental questions on subjects of interest. In May of 2017, a contingent worker supplement collected information on whether a worker can expect continuing employment from a particular employer or type of work. This defines contingent work, this expectation of continued employment. To estimate this, people are asked if they view their work as temporary, if so, why, and if they expect to stay employed for various lengths of time. The contingent worker supplement also attempts to determine if the person's work is in one of several particular employment arrangements, which I'll talk about today. The survey questions and responses about contingent work and work arrangement are 85 pages long, so it's a lot of really detailed information. I accessed the microdata for this analysis, which is the underlying individual survey responses, and I combined categories within the current population survey to increase the reliability of the data and address specific concerns within the construction industry. The current population survey is one of the few comprehensive current sources of information on characteristics of worker that is available by industry, so we're able to look specifically at these arrangements within the construction industry. I'll start by talking about work arrangements with what we're calling alternative work arrangements. The first alternative work arrangement are on-call workers and day laborers who only work when they're needed. These 2 types of non-standard work arrangement are grouped together in this analysis, and workers are included as an on-call worker or a day laborer if they said yes to the question, some people are in a pool of workers who only are called to work as needed, or some people get work by waiting at a place where employers pick up people to work for a day. These people are sometimes called day laborers. Workers provided by a contract firm are those who work for a contract company, usually work for only one customer, and usually work at the customer's work site. The typical example of this is a janitor who works for a janitorial services company but goes to the same retail establishment or bank every day to work for a different employer. Temporary help agency workers are workers who are paid by a temporary help agency. This category includes both the permanent staff of the agencies and those who are placed in temporary assignments at other companies. And then other contingent wage and salary workers are workers who meet the Bureau of Labor Statistics definition for contingent worker, who are wage and salary workers not in one of these other categories. These are workers who don't expect their job to last, and they're demographically quite similar to these other forms of alternative arrangement. These 4 categories together will be grouped in my analysis as alternative work arrangements. And to get to non-standard work arrangements, the topic of this presentation, we add independent contractors. Independent contractors are workers who answered yes to the question last week, were you working as an independent contractor, an independent consultant, or a freelance worker, or those who were identified as an unincorporated self-employed worker. It's standard in construction research to group unincorporated self-employed workers and independent contractors together. Workers in the independent contractor group are analyzed separately from those in alternative arrangements because they account for a large proportion of the construction workforce, and their characteristics are very different from other forms of alternative arrangements. According to these definitions, of 10.5 million construction workers, 22% were independent contractors, more than twice as many as the 9.1% of workers in all industries that are independent contractors. Another 810,000, or 8%, were in alternative arrangements, including 3.2% who were on-call workers or day laborers, 0.4% who were temporary help agency workers, 0.8% who were paid by contract firms, and 3.3% who were other contingent wage and salary workers. With the exception of temporary help agency workers, construction workers had a higher percentage of workers in each category of non-standard work arrangement than all industries. 30% of workers overall in construction were in non-standard work arrangement compared to 15% in all industries. This was the second highest percentage by industry after agriculture, forestry, and fishing. And just because I know this is confusing, I want to show one more slide about how these categories relate to each other before sharing more demographic and employment numbers. All construction workers for this report are either classified as standard or non-standard, and non-standard is further divided into alternative arrangement and independent contractor. Standard work arrangement, independent contractor, and alternative arrangement are the three categories I'll use going forward in this report. Before talking about demographic differences, I wanted to start with one demographic similarity, which is that 90% of workers in all work arrangements were male. Independent contractors were older than workers in both standard and alternative arrangement. On average, they were 47 years old. Workers in standard arrangements were 41 years old, and workers in alternative arrangements were 40 years old. The differences in age go beyond this. 33% of independent contractors were over 55, compared to 17% among workers in standard arrangements and 15% among workers in alternative arrangements. Workers in alternative arrangements were more likely to be young. 13% of them were under 24 years old, compared with 12% of standard worker and only 4% of independent contractors. Hispanic ethnicity was more common among workers in alternative arrangement. 42% of those workers were Hispanic, compared to 32% of workers in standard arrangement and 24% of independent contractors. There's data not shown, but workers in alternative arrangement were also more likely to be foreign-born, including 23% of the workers who were born in Mexico. Workers in alternative arrangement were more likely to have not obtained a high school diploma. 32% of workers in alternative arrangements were not high school graduates, compared to 21% in standard arrangement and 19% among independent contractors. And workers in non-standard work, including independent contractors and alternative work arrangements, were less likely to work a full-time schedule. When asked about their usual hours worked, only 46% of workers in alternative arrangements reported working full-time, and 28% of both workers in alternative arrangements and independent contractors worked part-time or less than 35 hours per week, more than double the percentage of workers in standard arrangements who worked part-time. Workers in standard arrangements and alternative arrangements had similar average and median wages. However, workers in non-standard arrangements reported a lower annual family income than those in non-standard arrangements. So this chart is showing in red the standard arrangement, and it's a gradation of income categories. So on the left hand of your screen is less income, and on the right hand of your screen is higher income, from making less than $15,000 a year to $100,000 a year. And you can see that the lines for independent contractor and alternative arrangements are above the line for standard arrangement at the low categories, representing that a higher proportion of workers are making those low incomes, and then below the red line, or the red background, at the higher income categories, showing that a higher percentage of workers in standard arrangements are making those higher incomes. Half of the construction workers in alternative arrangements would have preferred a different work arrangement. These preferences are very different from workers who were independent contractors, only 9 of whom would have preferred a different arrangement. When asked why they were working in an alternative arrangement, 29% of workers said that it was the only type of work they could find, and 22% cited other personal reasons, including child care problems, family or personal obligations, needing to obtain experience or training, or health limitations. Independent contractors cited very different reasons for not working in a standard job. 35% are working as independent contractors because they enjoy being their own boss, and 23% are working as independent contractors because they enjoy the flexibility of the schedule. Workers in alternative arrangements were less likely to have health insurance benefits from any source than workers in standard arrangements or independent contractors. Only 54% of workers in alternative arrangements had health insurance from any source, compared to 68% of workers in standard arrangements and 61% of independent contractors. 24% of workers in alternative arrangements received health insurance from their employer, compared with 42% of workers in standard arrangements. Independent contractors aren't shown here because a very small percentage of independent contractors get health insurance from their employment or employers. Also data I'm not showing because we've had enough numbers, but workers in alternative arrangements were also less likely to report being offered a retirement plan from their employer and were less likely to participate in a retirement plan when it was offered. What information can we take from this data? 30% of construction workers were employed in non-standard work arrangements, a higher percentage than all but one industry. The research shows significant differences in the demographic and employment characteristics of workers by work arrangements. Workers in alternative arrangements were more likely to be Hispanic and have less than a high school diploma, and half would have preferred a different work arrangement. Independent contractors were older, enjoyed being their own boss, and did not receive benefits from their employer. Workers in both types of non-standard work arrangement worked fewer hours and had a lower annual family income than those in standard arrangements. But there's also a lot of information that this data doesn't tell us. My own experience suggests that 30% of construction workers belonging to non-standard work arrangements is likely an underestimate. Sampling bias and interview bias might have caused differential misclassification. That means that workers who were in non-standard work arrangements might be less likely to respond to surveys or to understand surveys than workers in standard work arrangements. The non-response rate in May 2017 for this survey when it was collected was about 15%, including people who were not interviewed because no one was home or people who refused to interview. It's possible that people who were in alternative work arrangements, like day laborers or contract workers, might have been less likely to participate and thus cause these estimates of non-standard work arrangement to be underestimated, both in construction and in other industries. Confusion about terms like contract workers and temporary work might reduce the reliability of these estimates. This may be especially true among Spanish speakers. I say that as someone who's tried to translate concepts of work arrangement into Spanish and found it very difficult. To guard against this, the current population survey does offer detailed examples of what work arrangement means so that people who are responding can be guided to having accurate answers. Finally, there's no information on health outcomes or injuries. As long as the variables that we hypothesize are related to vulnerabilities are not asked on the same questionnaires as the ones where we measure health status or outcome, it's going to be difficult to relate these two concepts. So collecting information on non-standard work arrangements in other surveys and data systems is essential to accurately understanding the complex overlapping vulnerabilities associated with this kind of work. Others are working on how to continue to think about this and talk about this topic of non-standard work and creating definitions to use as the work itself changes and the work arrangements themselves change. I hope that the non-construction folks and the construction folks can come to some agreement about what counts as standard and what puts people at increased risk as we continue to do this research. As a data person, I always am prone to say that I think more research is necessary. This topic is going to continue to stay relevant, and other data sources should be used to examine these trends and improve our ability to manage them. We specifically need more information and more work on how this complex web of work arrangements affects occupational safety and health, as well as physical, mental, and emotional health. And finally, at CPWR, we'll continue to try to establish effective stakeholder partnerships to bridge the gap between these research findings, including things like this about non-standard work, and the people who understand what actually happens on construction sites. This research was supported by CPWR by a NIOSH cooperative agreement that's listed there. It's the subject of our next quarterly data report that should be out today and that Jess is going to send to everyone. So if you have questions about these numbers or want to see them in more detail or different format, that'll be available soon. And I will also take any questions.
All right, thanks, Rebecca. That was a great presentation. As she said, I, again, will be sending out a recording of today's event along with the link to that quarterly data report sometime in the next few days, so keep a lookout for that. And at this time, if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and enter them. If you think of any questions after the event, you're also always welcome to contact us offline. Okay. Our first question is, what is a fissured workplace?
Oh, that's a great question. So the term fissured workplace comes, at least in my knowledge, from a book by David Weil, and it's used to describe this idea that, like fissured, I think, it's a term from geology. It's like, it breaks apart. And so the idea is that, there are many different employers working at one establishment. So instead of working at a time where the janitors, the admin, the HR, the security guards, the executives, everyone who works for a different company all works for one employer, it's now increasingly true that, at least according to David Weil's research, that different employers work in the same building doing different kinds of work. So it's one other term that's used to refer to a different type of work arrangement and a non-standard work arrangement that's used today.
Okay. Can you cite any health studies tying to the work arrangements you discussed? What research has been completed so far?
I guess the question here is specifically about health studies. Yeah, I can, and I think so we do have this quarterly data report that's going to come out today that should have more citations. There's a paper by, so I don't know if it's really useful for me to list citations here. You could email me and I could tell them. But there has been work by, and I'm sorry if I butcher these people's names, especially if they're on the phone, but by Benach and Municher about precarious employment and health and developing a research agenda. There's been research by the Government Accountability Office on contingent workforce and work arrangements and health. There was a report both in 2006 and then in 2015 and then again in 2019. There's been research by someone named Smith, I can pronounce the name Smith, and Silverstein out in Washington looking, I know these people, looking at temporary workers in Washington State and looking at the differences of health outcomes. So that's some of, there was an article in the International Journal of Epidemiology about temporary employment and health that was a review study. So those are some of the things that look at health outcomes and work arrangement. As I said, the study that I did looking at the current population survey, there's nothing in there that's asked about health outcomes. So from this source, we aren't able to link the health outcomes with the vulnerabilities or with the work arrangement, but other people have done that research.
Okay, thank you. Mark, if you want to follow up more for links, you can do that over email with us. Our next question is there any data on injury and illness rates for so similar question for the various categories of contingent workers? So that would be I'm going to guess the same answer, getting to the health outcomes.
Yeah, it's still, it's not collected on the surveys that we get information on injuries and illness. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does collect contracted worker, but that term is slightly different from this and probably doesn't incorporate the same things that we think about when we think about this. So I definitely think that's something we need more data sources on in the future.
Yeah, so that was actually one of our next questions was how does the reporting affect computation of BLS industry injury rates? So our injury.
Can you repeat that question again?
Yeah, so how does the reporting affect computation of BLS industry injury rates? So it's sort of what you were just touching on, but saying so injuries to temp workers would be reported by the host employer, and how might that affect computation?
So I think that is right. That is definitely a complication. This is a household survey that got these numbers, so it's not reliant on employer reporting. So at least for these numbers that at least estimate prevalence and the underlying demographic and employment characteristics being different, that isn't dependent on employer reporting. So unlike injury data, that isn't an issue with this data.
Okay. And the next question is, CFOI counts self-employed. Which of these are included in your non-standard categories? Or I think maybe that means
I get what that means.
Categories you listed would be self-employed.
Yeah, so some independent contractors are, most independent contractors are self-employed. There is some overlap between self-employment and other forms of alternative work arrangement, but we're specifically, when we look at temporary help agency workers, those people aren't self-employed. I don't know that there's good data on how day laborers, if they report themselves as self-employed. I don't know if that's how they're counted in BLS. I do know that at least here there are really detailed questions about self-employed versus non-self-employed. And like I said, we categorized all unincorporated self-employed workers as independent contractors, which is fairly standard within construction. So that to the extent that they're unemployed or unincorporated self-employed workers, they would be counted as self-employed in CFOI and also as independent contractors in our research.
Okay. I think that was our, hold on, one more question. Does the survey data indicate the level and type of job safety training the various groups receive, if any, while on the job site?
No, I wish it did.
In follow-up to the self-employed conversation, doesn't CPS also say whether the worker is self-employed? How does that interact with the categories?
Yeah, so it does. That's true. And anyone who said that they were self-employed and unincorporated on CPS is included as an independent contractor. Those 22% of workers who were independent contractors either said that they were self-employed or they said that they were an independent contractor as part of the supplement, and some said both. I mean, like the majority said both. So that's how self-employed workers end up, that's how they're categorized here in the survey.
Okay. All right. Well, as I said before, if you have any questions that you think of after the event, feel free to email us, or if you'd like to follow up on anything, you can respond to any of the WebEx emails or contact Rebecca using the information you see on your screen right now, and you will receive some follow-up information from me, as I said, in the next 2 days. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Becky, again, for a great presentation.
Right, thanks.